It feels great outside today. I bet it would be a great time to go camping. Say the hungry beasts hidden behind the tree line. This world is a strange one. Telling stories of strange creatures is what I do best. Forests around the world are filled with creatures ripped straight from your nightmares. Animals that seem to live just to scare you sleepless for the rest of your life. In the following stories, it's interesting to wonder what these people really saw. I know that I would love to see something similar to these creatures in these stories myself. But if I did, you might not hear much of me on this channel after that, because something might just be picking me from its teeth. To all those monsters out there though, I don't recommend eating me. I'd say I'm the human version of a stale bologna sandwich. Anyway, are you ready for these allegedly real encounters with monsters in the forest? But first, have you ever been diving deep in the water and saw something creepy? I would love to hear your story. Just send it over at darknessprevails.org and we might feature it on this channel. Thanks. Now, let's get on with these stories that show us that every time we step into the woods, we step right onto the menu. Number 1. Hunter or Hunted. Submitted by Miles. About 4 or 5 years ago, when I was about 14 or 15, I went on a hunting trip with my grandfather. I had been hunting for a few years by this point, and I had grown up on a lot of a few acres, and my grandparents lived close by with 50 acres of their own that bordered public land and some old logging land. So all in all, I've spent a very good portion of my life in the forest, and I was no stranger to the wilderness. This all takes place in northern Idaho. I'd rather not disclose exactly where, for the sake of the residents of the area. I'll just say that this all took place a little over 10 miles north of the largest ski resort in the area. So if you're around here, you'll know the area I'm referring to. We drove out to a spot we had spotted some elk a few weeks back. We followed the paved road to the end, then continued on the dirt road for another few miles. We were deep in the woods by then. Eventually, we turned onto a side road. It looked like a better fit for a quad or a four-wheeler than my grandpa's pickup, but we were persistent and pig-headed, so of course we trekked on. Looking back, we probably should have turned back there, found another area, or went home altogether. Anyway, after another 30 minutes of driving down this rough dirt road, we reached the turnaround at the end. It was getting late by this point, but it was still light enough to see. There was a mountain stream that ran past the right side of the road. The stream ran down a wide ravine that came all the way down from the top of the mountain. So up here, you could see the majority of the mountain from where we stopped, despite the area being heavily forested. Off to the left of the road was nothing but thick trees and brush leading up the ridge. If you were at the edge, you could not see more than 5 feet in. That's how thick it was. So we proceeded to eat our dinner and get straight to bed, so that we could get an early start in the morning. My grandfather was too cheap to buy a tent or anything like that, so he generously took the truck seat, and I slept on the ever so inviting ground outside, in my old school military sleeping bag. Needless to say, I was not very comfortable due to the cold, and laying on the dirt road in nothing but a sleeping bag, so it was very slow getting to sleep. At one point during the night, I was awoken by the sound of something moving in the brush down the river. I got up and looked around, but it wasn't a very clear night and it was dark, so I didn't see anything. I wasn't scared at this point, I'd been in the woods a lot. Besides that, deer, elk, and a lot of animals are primarily nocturnal, so I brushed it off as nothing more than a deer moving through. So I laid back down and tried to get some sleep. Soon after that was another loud snap, but it was much closer to the road than before. I could tell by the sound that the branch snapping was big. Now more than ever, I knew that whatever was moving around and making that noise, it was no deer. I was a little on edge now, but I kept hoping that it was just a big bull elk moving through the area, and I tried to get to sleep. This time, almost immediately, the moment I tried to close my eyes, I heard more snapping. but this time it was coming from past the end of the road. It was no more than 15 feet in front of me. And it didn't stop with just one snap. I could hear something massive moving towards me through the thick brush. I immediately jumped back into the truck, waking my grandpa up. He didn't like this, but he asked me what was wrong. I told him as calmly as I could exactly what I had heard outside. He told me that it was probably a bear or an elk, or something like that I should probably just sleep in the truck. Being 14, I wanted to seem tough, especially in the eyes of my grandfather. So I pretended not to be shaken up from the whole thing, and I agreed with him. He sat up and we slept sitting on the opposite sides of the pickup. But I knew for dang sure whatever was out there was no bear, and it was definitely not an elk. From the first noise I heard, that was at least 50 yards out, from where I last heard the snapping to the end of the road, whatever was making it got there almost instantly, in the matter of only a few seconds. Any bear or elk would have had to be in a dead sprint to get there that fast, and it would have made a lot more noise. But there was no noise between the locations, not to mention if it was a bear or an elk, it wouldn't have wanted anything to do with us, and would have just kept running. I couldn't help but think that whatever it was, it wanted to get closer to me. But why? I sat there in the truck, with this uneasy feeling that whatever was out there was still there, and it was watching me. My exhaustion finally got the better of me and I finally went to sleep. The two of us woke up just as it was getting light enough to see. Legally, you have to wait 30 minutes after dawn to shoot anything, but we thought we would just wait to chamber our rifles and get a head start. We had planned to take the trail that crosses the stream and headed up the side of the mountain, but the wind was blowing right up the side of the place, so we quickly reconsidered. For those of you who are not hunters, you never want to walk with the wind, because the animals will smell you coming a mile away. We decided to walk down the road a little ways to see if there was a good way to head down the ridge. My grandpa then said that he thought there was an old logging road down there, and that would be a good place to find some elk. After only a couple of minutes, we heard something moving through the brush up the ridge and on the other side of the road. Thinking it may be an elk, we stopped and we listened. It was silent for a moment, but we soon heard heavy snapping moving in the direction of the truck. The same heavy snapping I had heard before. Instantly, this worried look grew on my grandpa's face, and he instructed me to quietly start walking back towards the truck. I had never seen him like this. What was he so scared of? What did he know that I didn't? As we moved back to the truck, the snapping grew louder, and it was becoming more and more clear that whatever was up there was massive. Suddenly, my grandpa turned to me and yelled to run, and we're both just booking it back to the truck. Goosebumps enveloped my whole body, and I don't remember ever being so panicked. We were only about 100 yards away, so it didn't take long for us to get back. When we finally made it, we stopped and listened to see if it was still out there. And it was. Like it was right there. It had ran after us, still in the brush, and stopped when we had stopped. We could hear it moving around in the brush just up the other side of the road. I mean, it couldn't have been more than 15 feet away from us. The next thing I knew, I heard the most bone-chilling sound I could possibly imagine. It was like a bear's roar, but it was louder and distorted, and it seemed to last forever. If I had to describe it, I would say it sounded like a bear had been possessed by the most violent, angry demon you could think of. Better yet, this creature was still trudging through the brush, getting ever closer to the two of us. My grandpa swore under his breath, saying that he left his keys in the bag, and I will never forget what he said to me next. He swallowed hard, looked at me, and said in a scared voice that I'd never heard from him, "This thing is angry, and it's coming at us. Chamber around, and as soon as it breaks through the brush, shoot to kill." At that moment, I realized we were no longer hunting. We were no longer on a little enjoyable trip. We were about to fight for our lives. We were now both leaning on the bed of the truck, guns loaded and ready to shoot whatever might come charging out of that brush. Then came yet another blood-curdling roar. I was shaking so bad, I could have soiled myself at any moment and never noticed. All I could think of was what was making that terrible roar. We sat there for a painful eternity as it drew closer and closer, and we were waiting, just waiting. Just as the creature got to the point of breaking through the trees where we could see it, it stopped. It must have saw that we were armed or something, saw that we were cornered yet ready, because now the noise turned and it continued up the side of the mountain as fast as it had came. Needless to say, we packed up everything and called it a day. My grandfather is a die-hard Bigfoot enthusiast, but I've always been a bit more skeptical. We have now both spent an exceptional amount of time hunting. My grandfather grew up hunting in these forests, and he has spent a fair amount of time living in Alaska hunting bears. We both agree that whatever was out there sounded like no bear we'd ever heard. I don't know what was pursuing us that morning, but whatever it was big, and it was angry that we were out there, and it was something that I didn't know existed. I still hunt and spend a lot of time in the woods, but for the life of me, I'll never go back to that area again. Number 2. UK Dogman Encounter. Submitted by DAMON-ASTON. I am a 23-year-old guy from the West Midlands of England in the UK. Now, I don't live far from a place called Cannock Chase, and this is where my encounter took place. It happened when I was 19 years of age. I had just completed a new album, and at that age, with any excuse, me and my friends, Peggy, Rosalind, my boyfriend James, and his friends Francis and Eamon, took the chance to have a little private celebration in the Chase. We went to our local off-license, bought some booze, and off we went for an all-nighter in the woods, as is the norm for teens. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, we were at our usual spot, and we were in the midst of drinking. About an hour later, we were getting tipsy and having a good time, playing my new tunes from James's Bluetooth speaker, when suddenly Peggy screamed. I was shocked and surprised. I asked her, "What the heck is wrong with you?" She said, I swear I just saw a bear by that log." Now, Peggy has always been a little ditzy and is often the butt end of our jokes with some of the things that she comes out with. So everyone just burst into laughter, and Francis said, "You don't get bears in England, you div." Everyone laughed it off and got back to drinking. However, I could not help but think. I had heard of the Cannock Chase werewolf before. I never believed it, mind you. Men that turn into wolves. Come on. I wasn't a kid. I just thought it was a folktale, like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. But without thinking too much of it, I just registered the thought and carried on with my merriment. Peggy, however, could not. She was jumpy and on edge. I watched her, and she kept looking around herself into the woods. Just seeing her that way, it was a bit eerie. An hour or so later, I was a tad bit merry, and it was also apparent that I needed to use the bathroom. So I went a little off into the woods to get some privacy. I found a spot and began. As I was doing my thing, though, I heard leaves crackling in a footstep-like fashion. I stopped, then called out, "Hello? Babe, is that you?" There was no reply, so I got back to my business, just to hear that sound come again. Carrying on this time, I called, "Guys, if you're trying to scare me, it's too bad. I'm too tipsy to care." I just finished up when I heard a deep, guttural growl emit from the darkness near me. I looked around, now quite frightened, but I could not see a thing. I quickly ran as fast as I could back to the others and into James's arms. "Whoa, what's wrong?" he asked. I told him what had happened, and he just laughed at me. "Sounds like you had a bit too much to drink." I scowled at him. "Don't be rude. I'm serious." "It was probably just your imagination after too much drinking, and Peggy's eyes have always needed testing," he said, as him, Francis, and Eamon all started laughing. "Fine. Don't believe me," I snapped, sitting on the log next to me with obvious annoyance. Rosalind sat next to me. I know he's being a prick, but he's probably right. It's probably just the drink, that's all. I know she was trying to be nice and comfort me, but I know what I heard. I know I hadn't imagined it. I sat there for the next hour seething to myself, slowly sobering up. I was so mad that the only person who seemed to believe me was Peggy. My own boyfriend was just laughing at me with his mates. Every now and then, one of them would make a snarky comment towards me, and I just snapped. I told James to piss off, that he and his friends can take their snarky comments and shove them somewhere. I got up and stormed off into the woods, James trying to call me back, but I ignored him until he was out of earshot. I found a little spot a while away, and I sat down and started to cry. I was still a little tipsy, heightened emotions and all that, you know. But then through my tears, I heard those footsteps again. I stopped myself and I focused, listening. They sounded like they were getting closer. I looked around to the general direction I was hearing them, but I could not see anything. I slowly got up, trying not to alert whatever it was to the fact that I could hear it, in case it was some knife-wielding nutcase. I walked a little more and realized that in my anger, I hadn't taken note of the direction that I had come from. Crap, I thought. They better be looking for me. I walked until I found a big tree that my whole body would fit behind, and I slipped in behind it. Now I was scared. I might have been lost, and I could hear the crunching of leaves getting closer and closer to me. I stood there shaking, thinking, this is it. I'm about to be murdered by some weirdo creeping around the woods in the middle of the night. That is, until I heard what sounded like a dog sniffing the air, and it was coming from right behind the tree I was hiding behind. Sighing a massive breath of relief and thinking, oh thank heavens it's just a pooch, I turned around and I saw a massive, 8-foot-tall beast standing on its hind legs before me. It was the very last thing in the world I was expecting. But in that split second, I wasn't scared, like as if some primal instinct held me for a moment before logical thought kicked in. Unlike the stories you hear, it was a very beautiful creature. It was sturdy and muscular, and it had shaggy, matted light brown fur, a fluffy mane around its neck, and like a German shepherd's shaggy tail, its face resembled a wolf. In fact, he kinda looked like my Siberian husky. Only this thing's eyes were more of a golden yellowish color. Despite this creature before me, it was awe-inspiring. That is, until rational thinking kicked back in, and I suddenly thought, I've got to get out of here. This monster is going to kill me. I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction of the beast. He seemed to give me a head start. Then suddenly I heard him. It got on all fours and ran like the wind, taking no time to catch up with me. And before I knew it, I was slammed to the ground face first, and I felt a sharp pain in my elbow down to my fingers, and I screamed. The weight of the creature was immense and almost unbearable. I could feel the beast try to get its snout in my face, but then it began to sniff at me. I could feel the hair on its face tickle my ear. It didn't seem threatening at all, to be honest. I thought this thing was trying to eat me, not be curious or try to play. Or maybe I was being hopeful. And that's when I heard my friends. Damon, where are you? Are you okay? What the? I felt the weight on my back shift, and I turned over as quietly as possible, trying not to get the attention back on me, because the creature was now looking at my friends. And as quick as it had appeared, the thing bounded off into the night, and it was unnervingly fast. James ran to me, a very worried look on his face, asking me if I was okay or hurt. Then he started apologizing for letting me run off like that. I'm fine, I promised, but my mind seemed worlds away. Then I realized that when I fell, I had hurt my elbow, and later I found out that it was a slight dislocation. But oddly enough, this was from the fall. If this animal wanted to hurt me, it would have. I had a lot of trouble coming to terms with it all, simply because I wondered if I was going crazy. But if that were the case, that would mean James, Francis, and Peggy were all crazy too. They had seen it. From my experience, I just want others to know that not all dogmen, werewolves, and lycans, whatever each person may call them, aren't as vicious as you make them out to believe. If they do exist, I believe they're just another natural creature of the earth, an intimidating yet beautiful one that you really need to be cautious around. But they most certainly aren't evil. Thank you for listening, and I hope others can take comfort in my story as I have in theirs. Number 3. White Creature. Submitted by Al. I love to take long walks. It's a great form of exercise, and it helps me calm down and decompress from the stresses of everyday life. I'm 27 now, but I began to love long walks at about the age of 14. And my favorite time to take these long walks are at night, or at least it used to be. I've had a few creepy things happen on these walks, but what happened this night, it takes the cake. Me and my friend Jack, 17 and 19 years old respectively, would stay over at my house. We would work on our cars, watch movies, and all of that. Jack was a fitness kind of guy, so it didn't take too much convincing to get him to go on these long walks with me. I live in the suburbs of Chicago. What a lot of people who are not from that area of Chicago may not know is that if you go outside of Chicago an hour or so, in just about any direction, you'll find almost nothing but small, quiet towns surrounded by cornfields. That is exactly what my town was like. So on one of these nights, we decided to go on a long walk. We walked around my subdivision and made our way to the pitch-black country roads surrounded by woods. So far, nothing was out of the ordinary. We were walking, enjoying the cool night air, looking at the stars, talking about our race cars and girls, of course. We actually made it quite a long way away from the house. After walking about 45 minutes, we began getting tired and decided to turn back. I would guess it was around 12:30 or 1 in the morning at this point. Now, this was back in 2007, when not everyone had a cell phone. So when it got really late, we would use our cell phone to call our girlfriend's house phone. Both our girlfriends happened to be sisters. By this time, their parents had usually fallen asleep, so we could stay up and chat with our girlfriends without their parents getting pissed at us. Everything was going well, just about how all of our nights had gone. I should explain that this road has almost nothing on it, just the occasional country home very spread apart from each other. And again, it's almost all cornfields, except for one part, where it's just the thickest woods I've ever seen. But it's not quite large enough to call a forest, but somewhat heavily wooded. There's also a small creek that runs through the property, and underneath the street, then back out through the other side. Jack and I were now walking on this road. Now, on this piece of property, there is a creepy old white house. But I don't know exactly what made this house so creepy, but I can genuinely say that even before this incident, I got a really bad vibe from it. However, not enough of a vibe to stop me from street racing in front of it several times up and down the road. Stupid, I know, but I was a high schooler with an odd obsession for fast cars, so a lot of people from my school wanted to race me. Since this was such a flat road and was in the middle of nowhere, it was pretty much the best place to race. Back to that night though. Jack was on the phone with his girlfriend. We began to come up on that part of the road where the small creek ran underneath it. Everything seemed normal though. Then the night took a swift turn for the worst. Suddenly a creature came out of the water near the trees and stood no less than 2 feet away from me. I was startled. This thing moved without a sound, with no water movement or splashing. There was absolutely no trace of its presence, yet there it was in front of us. It was like it didn't exist 1 second, and then the next it did, and it emerged right next to me. For a moment I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed. I turned to my friend who was on my right, with this thing on my left. I saw that Jack had stopped speaking entirely, and he was just frozen, looking at the creature just past me. He stood completely still, as if he also didn't know what to do. We were both amazed and scared. Just typing this story out sends goosebumps all over my body. The creature was like nothing I've ever seen before, even in the movies, against the natural background of a creek and trees behind it. It was solid white and bright, but it wasn't glowing. I was looking up toward the top of it, where its face should have been, but it seemed to be completely featureless. Now, I'm 6 feet tall and had to look up at this thing, so it must have been at least 7 feet tall. It was also quite big around, almost egg-shaped. Oddly though, the creature didn't move at all. It just stood there. Then simultaneously, the two of us took off. Without saying a word, we simply sprinted as fast as we could. As we were sprinting, I did turn back while still running full speed, and I saw the thing go back into the water the same way it had come out, with no movement of its body. Almost as if it was floating, but not gracefully the way you would imagine. The way it moved and existed was so unnatural. It sent chills down my body. Soon we were past the trees and back on paved road, and soon we rounded the corner where my subdivision began. We were completely unsure of what we just saw. We turned back and heard the strangest sound we've ever heard. It didn't sound anything like an animal, almost a mix between a growl, a howl, and a moan. Again, without words, we both began running all the way back to my house. When we got there, we were both at a loss for words. We decided we didn't want to stay, so we decided to jump in his car to try to see something, anything with high beams on, partly wanting to find out what that thing was. We were both and still are big athletic guys, and we were trying to rationalize what we had just seen, scared out of our minds. But when we got back there was no sign of it being there at all. There was nothing. We turned around and found an officer on patrol. We flagged them down and told them exactly what had happened, that someone should check that out. We didn't really officially file a report or anything, but we did see the officer drive off in that direction. However, I don't think anything came of it. Given the context of this story, I should mention that neither of us were drunk or high whatsoever. At this point, we had actually never even touched the stuff. To this day, though, I still have no idea what that creature could have been, where it came from, what it wanted, and though confusing, I'm just glad it didn't harm us. If anyone else has had an encounter like this, please share. I would like to try to figure out what in the world this thing was. Number 4. Mysterious Flying Creature. Submitted by Jake. This happened 2 years ago when I was 17. It was New Year's Eve and we were all busy partying at our farmhouse. My cousin Joe suggested we go out into the woods to do some stargazing after the celebrations. Joe and I had a lot of common friends since we attended the same school, so we got 2 of our friends to come with us. It was a cloudy night, but it was also a full moon. We went out in my uncle's old 1964 pickup. After a solid 15-minute ride, we reached a clearing in the forest. We set up camp in the clearing and took out our equipment. After spending about 4 hours looking at the sky, we called it a night and crawled into our separate tents. We only pitched 2 tents to save us the trouble of cleaning up. At about 5 o'clock in the morning, though, I heard this loud screeching sound coming from the tree line nearby. I peered out of the nylon tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that odd noise, and what I saw next made my heart sink into my stomach. The thing looked like a giant insect, but it seemed partly humanoid. It had dark, unruly hair around its body, and 2 large compound eyes staring at us. I looked back and tried to wake up my cousin, but he was already wide awake. The 2 of us made a break for the other tent. My cousin's friends, however, were already in the truck waiting for us. Apparently, they had seen and heard the thing long before we did. We got in after them, and we hit the gas pedal, flooring the truck through the woods. We reached the farmhouse a short while later. Before we left the truck, though, I turned around. I saw that thing flying towards the woods. Whatever it was, it had thick leathery wings, which seemed to be a cross of the wings of an insect and those of a bat. After returning home, I did some research on that creature, hoping to get some answers, and it bore some resemblance to the Mothman, a mysterious moth-like creature that is said to be the harbinger of destruction. Now, this was in Virginia, only about 80 or so miles away from Point Pleasant, so I wouldn't be surprised if what we saw that day was, in fact, the Mothman. And number 5, One Time in the Woods, submitted by Gary G. I grew up on a farm surrounded by woods, and where there weren't woods, there were fields. Our property was edged by 2 creeks, the smaller feeding into the larger. The larger creek was dangerous, as some parts were only inches deep, while other parts were as deep as 20. I saw many things in that creek, and most of them with my best friend John. I'm no stranger to being in the woods, and I know that the woods can be inherently creepy to those who spend a little time in them. Forests are full of eyes watching you, even if you can't see them, but for the most part they go unnoticed by our senses. Sometimes, though, I felt something or someone watching me in them. I refused to ever go into the woods alone at night, because it was during the dusk, in the dark, when the feeling of being watched was the most pervasive. The moment I'm recounting here only happened to us once, and I will never forget it. It was July, and anyone who lives in Texas knows July is boilingly hot. After a day of working for my older brother, John asked if we could go for a swim before heading inside. I refused at first as dusk was coming quickly. John begged though, and I relented. I relented because I grabbed my gun and a bag of firecrackers. Directly behind my house, the creek was 9 feet deep or so, and we were making a game out of John trying to dive as I threw firecrackers into the water after him. I didn't get in the water myself. I wanted to stand watch. I don't know why, but that's what I was doing. I was cautious, maybe a bit paranoid. Soon the 2 of us calmed down and he was just relaxing in the water, and I had stopped throwing firecrackers. The woods surrounding us returned to normal as the birds and insects began to chirp again. Silence in forests is almost unheard of. There's almost always the scurrying of small animals, and the singing of birds, and the sounds of insects looking for a mate. It can be easily ignored and taken for granted, but it's always there. That is why when all of the sounds suddenly disappeared, John and I grew worried. I remember looking around, the loudness of the silence only broken by the slow gurgling of the creek. That is when the smell hit us. It was the gut-wrenching scent of rotting fish. We froze when the smell appeared, but we became paralyzed as it grew stronger. I could feel the hair on my body stand on end. It felt as though we were surrounded by eyes, as though the whole forest had grown malevolent and was bearing down on us. For several minutes, I sat on the rocky bank still as John floated next to me. The smell was bad, but it had stopped growing stronger. Instead, in the dark, we heard all too heavy footsteps coming closer. Night was almost upon us, but we were simply too afraid to move. Suddenly, without warning, the smell grew so powerful, it was as if some creature was right behind us, and the sound of footsteps seemed only a few feet away, just beyond the tree line, and the feeling of eyes watching us was stronger than I've ever felt before. My whole body was telling me to run, to get out of there. I snatched my gun just as John pulled himself out of the water. We ran for our lives, not knowing at all what had been there with us. Anyone we have told this story to has simply shrugged it off and dismissed it. I suppose you would have to be there to feel that feeling of being watched, to feel that awful malevolence. I have never experienced anything like that before, and I hope I never do, because I know that night my subconsciousness was telling me that we weren't alone. The existence of such creatures in these stories is argued about constantly. Many people believe what they have seen. Others say they are just lying, that we would have already discovered these monsters if they did in fact exist. But life and reality is far more complicated than that. Who's to say these creatures belong to our dimension? They seem to appear and disappear at random. Perhaps they are a leak from a dimension parallel to our own. In that way, what happens if we leak into their dimension? Maybe that will explain many of these missing people cases in the woods. Maybe the dimension shifts around you into theirs, and before it shifts back, you become eaten alive. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget to send us your diving stories soon at darknessprevails.org. Thanks.